Once again, folks, we are just waiting for attendees to load, and we will start the program in a minute. Well, I think we're ready to start. We still have some attendees loading in, but I want to be respectful of people's time. Panelists, please turn your camera off and keep yourselves on mute until we start. I'm Orit Frankel, co-founder and CEO of the American Leadership Initiative. And our goal in creating ALI was to develop, in consultation with policymakers and other stakeholders, a 21st century vision and policy agenda for American global leadership based on American interests and shared values. We focus on 5 pillars: advancing inclusive and sustainable growth at home and around the world, pursuing smart trade, leading on climate, meeting the China challenge, and promoting democracy, human rights, and rule of law. In thinking about the many challenges that the new administration and Congress will face, we wanted to tackle the immediate and complex challenges of digital technology. And I think we've all seen, especially over the past year, that the digital revolution has really remade the way that we've all worked, learned. It's changed the economic landscape and really even altered America's relationships with the rest of the world. We believe, however, that with the right policies, digital technologies can create a more exclusive and growing American economy with good jobs, digital governance to protect democracy and support inclusive growth around the world, and really position the U.S. as a global digital leader. We consulted with policymakers to develop a digital policy roadmap for the Biden administration and Congress. We issued our report last week that represents a culmination of that work. And if you haven't already downloaded it from our website, www.american-leadership.org, I encourage you to do so. We're super excited about the all-star lineup of panels participating in this program, who will share their views on the policies that they recommend the administration and Congress adopt to ensure that the promise of technology contributes to inclusive growth and is aligned with the values of democracy, transparency, and accountability. Please join our conversation in 2 ways. You can put your questions into the Zoom Q&A function, and we will try to get to as many questions as we can at the end of each panel. And secondly, join us on Twitter with #ALI or #GlobalDigitalStrategy. With that, it is my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Senator Robert Menendez, Chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and also a member of the Finance and Banking Committees. As many of you know, Chairman Menendez's story is really the quintessential American story. He grew up as the son of Cuban immigrants in New Jersey, rose to be elected as a member of Congress, where he served for 13 years, and then joining the Senate, where he has now served for 15 years. He has long been a strong advocate of American global leadership and economic statecraft as necessary tools to allow America to prosper in the global economy. In September of last year, Senator Menendez, along with other leading Democrats, introduced the America Leads Act, which he will discuss during his remarks. The bill sets a new tone for American global engagement and meeting the challenge of a rising China. With that, we're going to turn to Senator Menendez.
Thank you. It's an honor to speak with the American Leadership Initiative today. As the new chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, I look forward to discussing how we can restore American leadership in the world after 4 turbulent years of President Trump. The past year alone is rife with examples of the Trump administration failures. The world has witnessed the United States utterly fail at containing COVID-19, reckon with racial injustices that have plagued us since our founding, and suffered a violent insurrection at the seat of our government. I suspect we've yet to fully comprehend the damage done to our credibility by the events of January 6th, when an angry mob fueled by lies, disinformation, and encouragement from President Trump himself attempted to overthrow a fair and free election. Look no further than President Zelensky of Ukraine's statement last week. After something like this, he said, I believe it would be very difficult for the world to see the United States as a symbol of democracy. Well, my friends, this is music to our adversaries' ears. This is the ammunition they need to foment a narrative against American values and make the case that democracy does not work. Well, we cannot and should not pretend that we are the perfect union we strive to be, but we can rally the world through our commitment to never stop reaching for it, to never give up on it, to continue working to build a country built on justice, equal rights, and opportunity for all. And these values that shape us domestically must be the same ones that guide our foreign policy. That is how we remind the world who we are, what we stand for, and how we will lead. With new leadership in not just the White House, but also the Senate, we must seize this opportunity to begin undoing the damage wrought by the Trump administration's retreat from the world and begin restoring our rightful place as a leader of nations. This won't happen overnight. The world looks very different today than it did back in 2016. China and other authoritarian countries worked aggressively to fill the vacuum left by our absence, grow their power, and expand their economic influence around the world. So how do we get back on track? How do we show the world that the United States is serious about helping write rules for the 21st century global economy that promote transparency, responsible stewardship of natural resources, human rights, and shared prosperity? It starts, but it does not end, with presidential leadership. Already, President Biden, in his first 2 weeks in office, has re-entered the Paris Climate Accord, called out gross human rights violations in Russia and China, rejoined the World Health Organization, restored international protections for women, girls, and LGBTI individuals, and called on all of us to resurrect a sense of national unity and common purpose. I applaud these steps. Yet repairing our standing abroad demands much more. The Trump administration's embrace of an inward-looking America First approach more often left our country isolated and our workers behind. As I touched on earlier, when we are not leading at the table, we are ceding that space to actors who do not share our values or our vision for free societies and fair markets that allow everyone to work hard and build brighter futures for their children. We have seen it when, for example, China has taken on leadership roles in UN bodies. Bit by bit, China bends these organizations into vessels for their own unilateral priorities, often at the expense of human rights, free and open commerce, labor rights, and an inclusive and fair global trade and economic order. The United States helped build the liberal order of the 20th century, and the world welcomed China into it. Unfortunately, the Beijing of the 21st century is intent on remaking the world in its own repressive image through old-fashioned military antagonism, predatory economic practices, and creeping digital authoritarianism. We see it in its Belt and Road Initiative, through which China uses lucrative port contracts and infrastructure projects to grow its tentacles and win friendly trade terms. Likewise, China is determined to export its brand of digital authoritarianism around the world. As I laid out last year in a committee report entitled "The New Big Brother," they are leveraging their entire policy toolkit, including political, economic, diplomatic, and coercive means to shape the digital domain in its own image. If successful, China, and not the United States and other like-minded nations, will be writing the future of cyberspace. It's not too late to set a new course, but time is certainly running out. Indeed, China and the Communist Party under Xi Jinping's brand of hypernationalism is unlike any challenge America has ever faced. These challenges demand the United States approach our relationship with China through a lens of strategic competition. We must be clear-eyed and sober about Beijing's intentions and calibrate our policy and strategy accordingly. And we must recognize that in the 21st century, our strategic competition will revolve around geoeconomics, not the geopolitical competition of the past. The future will not be won with blood and steel, but rather with silicon and human ingenuity. With the most hotly contested domains in new and emerging technologies like 5G, AI, quantum computing, nanotech, robotics, and zero-carbon energy technology, the United States must cement our position as the world's greatest innovator. For if we fail to raise our geoeconomic game, if we fail to replenish the sources of our competitiveness, we will find that while we still may dominate in the old domains like military power, the world has moved on, leaving us behind. So how do we do this? We must remember that America did not become the greatest innovator in the world by accident. We invested in innovation through R&D, through education, and through the creation of opportunities that empowered Americans to outcompete and out-innovate the world. And we in Congress, as the direct representatives of the American people, must strive to do it again. That's why late last year, I joined a number of my Democratic colleagues to introduce the America Leads Act. This bill seeks to do four things. 1, invest in American competitiveness. 2, invest in American alliances and partners. 3, invest in our values. And 4, invest in our economic statecraft and ensure China pays a price for its predatory actions. America Leads is comprehensive and coherent strategy for preparing America to compete and win in the 21st century. It will leverage our resources and create policies that mobilize all aspects of U.S. national power, sparing investments here at home in our workers, in education, in science and technology, and in innovation so that we can retool our workforce for the future. The broader diplomatic and security architecture of America Leads aims to get China right by first getting our Indo-Pacific strategy right. We must reinvigorate our alliances and partnerships, champion the values that make America exceptional, and lean into economic statecraft. Our strategy must be built on a tough, pragmatic, and realistic appraisal of how to best combat China's predatory economic and trade practices. Critically, the legislation also includes provisions for the development and implementation of robust regional strategies to meet the challenge that China poses in Europe, the Western Hemisphere, Africa, the Middle East, the Arctic, and of course, the Indo-Pacific itself. America Leads also aims to ensure the United States is well positioned to shape the 21st century digital arena. We must ensure that not only is our communications technology infrastructure safe and secure, but that our allies and partner systems are as well. This will call for a new focus on digital economic statecraft. I think back to the aftermath of World War II when the United States projected our leadership abroad with a Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe. 70 years later, we need a new Marshall Plan. This one focused on the emerging new battlegrounds of the 21st century, economic statecraft, and the digital domain. That's why in the coming weeks, I plan to introduce a new vision for economic statecraft focused on securing our leadership in the digital domain. We must strengthen our supply chains and export controls, foster cooperation in our multilateral institutions, and reform our international sanctions. We must seize this moment to shape the digital domain in ways that support democratic values such as openness, freedom, human rights, and the rule of law. We can't compete in the 21st century with a 20th century government model any more than we could fly a man to the moon on a Model T. We must build and invest and pour resources into a 21st century model that empowers Americans to compete in the digital domain. And we must recognize that government cannot do it alone. We must incentivize the private sector to invest in digital infrastructure projects around the world in coordination with the digital infrastructure security strategy. And we must provide technical assistance to governments to protect the integrity of their telecom networks and their critical infrastructure. Now, I realize that this is a laundry list of big structural issues that we will need to confront as a nation. But it is essential that the United States meet this moment. We must remind the world who we are. For I believe we are still the nation that led the Allies to victory in World War II and freed Europe and Asia from the grips of tyranny and fascism. I believe we are still the nation that created the post-war international order and helped bring millions out of poverty and into prosperity and security. And I believe that we are still the country that built an economic system the world looks up to, where anybody, regardless of your race, your gender, or where you came from, can achieve the American dream. I know it because I've lived that dream. Long before I was chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, I was the son of poor Cuban immigrants who came to this country in search of freedom and opportunity. That I could rise to this position as one of 100 United States senators in a nation of more than 320 million people, or that another child of immigrants named Kamala Harris could one day be vice president, inspires the world to hope for something better. We may not be perfect, but we will never stop trying to build that more perfect union, and I would argue, a more perfect world. One that reflects our cherished commitment to free societies, free markets, freedom of expression, freedom of movement, and the dignity of all mankind. It won't be easy. Nothing worth doing ever is. But I believe we can do it, and I would never bet against the United States and the American people. Thank you.
Our thanks to Chairman Menendez for those very important remarks. I was especially happy to hear the chairman talk about a new Marshall Plan. ALI has been championing for quite a while the notion of a digital Marshall Plan that would provide financing for U.S. technology companies, allowing them to compete on a level playing field with China's companies that receive subsidized financing. And it would also ensure that developing countries can purchase internet equipment that is consistent with an open, accountable, and democratic internet. Second, his focus on invigorating our international partnerships is timely and important. The U.S. can't address the challenges of China alone, and we need to build regional strategies and stronger Pacific and transatlantic ties. He also mentioned he will be introducing a new vision for economic statecraft in the digital domain. And I noticed this morning that Senator Schumer, along with some other senators, introduced some legislation promoting competitiveness in semiconductors, 5G, and other key technologies. And I wonder if that is what Senator Menendez is referring to. Finally, he highlighted the importance of a 21st century model to empower Americans to compete in the digital domain, focusing on preparing American workers for the realities of competition with China and other countries. And this notion really leads us into our first panel on domestic priorities and policies to ensure that American citizens have access to digital training, equipment, broadband, and policies that strengthen US competitiveness and protect our democracy, technology, and innovation. So I think we have our first panel with us. And with that, I'm going to turn ask the panelists to turn their cameras on and their mics on. And after about 40 minutes, I will give I'll come back and give the panel the opportunity to answer some questions that were posed by the audience in Zoom. We have an all-star panel and that I'm very excited to hear from. Everyone should have received their bios, but if you haven't, they're available now on our website. Our panel includes Congresswoman and retired Air Force Captain Chrissy Houlihan from Pennsylvania, who sits on the Foreign Affairs, Armed Services, and Small Business Committees. Ambassador Karen Kornbluth, Senior Fellow and Director of Digital Innovation and Democracy Initiative at the German Marshall Fund. Fred Humphreys, Vice President at Microsoft and a leader in Microsoft's initiative to create jobs and promote inclusivity. And certainly, last but certainly not least, Ambassador Michael Froman, former U.S. Trade Representative under President Obama, and now Vice Chairman of MasterCard. Steve Clemens will do the honors and moderate the panel. Steve is currently the editor-at-large at The Hill and writes and speaks frequently on many of the policy issues that the panel will be discussing. With that, over to you, Steve. Take it away.
Great. Good morning, everyone, and great to be with you. Hopefully I'm being heard here and on board. Captain Houlihan, great to see you again. Karen, Michael, Fred, we've all kind of worked with each other or for each other at various times, so it's good to see everyone. But let me just open up, and I'm going to jump in. I should also mention that when Representative Houlihan has to leave at 10:15, she loved this panel anyway. She's not quitting early just because she didn't enjoy the conversation. So I just want to get that out there first. But let me start to launch a question. This morning, President Biden, let me just properly read it, listed out a fact sheet of various things called Securing America's Critical Supply Chains. And in this initiative, the president's really identifying this digital space, this digital world, as one where there are fragilities. It's not just making things, it's the question of the safety of our infrastructure, the quality and of our workforce in comparison to workforces elsewhere, and identifying the topic that we're having here as a vital part of our national security base. Mike, we're beginning to see, or I should say Ambassador Froman, we're beginning to see the evolution of a kind of digital mercantilism. The digital world, and Fred knows this from way back, was supposed to be this platform where, as we got more and more connected with each other globally, trust rose. But we seem to be in a high fear world or a high competitive world where mercantilism and competition and national technology has come in. And so let me just start with you and get your framing as a former U.S. trade representative who knows this world well to help us understand what's the scaffolding on this that we need to know in terms of getting American policy right, but also understanding that this is the hot game when it comes to international trade, commerce, and protectionism. And then I want to jump to Representative Houlihan to say, how is she going to fix it?
Great. Well, thank you for having me, and it's good to see all of you. And I just want to commend the ALI for this report, which is really a terrific piece of work, both on the domestic and on the international front. And I think it will contribute significantly to this conversation. Steve, to your point, governments around the world are grappling with the challenges of the digital economy, and they have a number of legitimate interests that they need to address, including things like the privacy of individuals. But oftentimes they jump to a mercantilist or a protectionist solution, which may, in many respects, throw out the baby with the bathwater. I think there are
Right.
ways of moving forward that allow governments to address their legitimate concerns on cybersecurity, on privacy, a number of other areas, without sacrificing the increasing productivity, the increasing innovation that comes from an open digital economy. And I think that's really the challenge for us to address. A lot of attention is being paid to trade in goods, which is absolutely critical, including manufactured goods. But the line between manufacturing and services and the digital economy is quite permeable now. And so digital services play such a critical role, not only in their own ecosystem, but in the manufacturing sector, in agriculture, in entertainment, and any number of other areas. And being able to ensure that we have a competitive environment that allows us to have a system that reflects our interests and our values, that we're supporting it domestically through the kinds of things that have been recommended in this report, but that we're also dealing with other like-minded countries to set certain standards, to coordinate where we can on regulation, so that we can maintain the benefits of an open digital economy is going to be paramount.
I mean, before I jump to Chrissy Houlihan, who are wearing the white hats in this story and who are wearing the black hats?
Well, Steve, the world isn't as simple as black and white. But I would say that there are a lot of countries that have a set of shared values around openness, around respecting individuals' rights to privacy, respecting that individuals should control their data, benefit from their data, own their data, and the role of the rest of us is to protect their data. There are countries and institutions that have shared values around cybersecurity and the importance of protecting it. And particularly in the context of COVID, where we've seen just how important it is to be connected to the digital economy, whether you're an individual in order to get access to support from your governments or others, or a small business who, in order to survive, have gone from being brick and mortar to being an online e-commerce participant. The importance of issues like cybersecurity just become paramount.
Great, thank you. Representative, I know that was an unfair question, Mike, I'm sorry, but Representative Houlihan, you have talked a lot about what America needs to do in terms of upgrading its skills, its technological muscle. I've often thought when President Biden is asked about, how are we going to compete with China, for instance, in this front, why he doesn't respond and say, let's triple the National Science Foundation budget. I mean, let's build the partnerships, the investment in research. How are you and your colleagues feeling this challenge right now and sensing what the opportunities are to make a difference in America's overall competitiveness?
So I could talk a long time about this particular question, but I think before we're able to sort of join a world of white hats who share our values and who are interested in kind of building the digital world that we can all imagine, we first have to make sure that we're competitive in that space. And I don't think right now that we are. We haven't made, as you mentioned, the right investments in science and in AI and biotech and quantum computing and all of those kinds of in cyber. And we also haven't made the right investments in our human capital and our human resources to make sure that we have a really robust and rigorous STEM talent pipeline. And that's not just a STEM pipeline of people who are doing the AI and biotech and that kind of thing, but it's a pipeline that is in places like, Congress, as an example. When you look at our membership, our body, we have only not even 24 members who have a STEM background, who have kind of the vocabulary and the interest in these areas that are you're being asked, you ask me, how will we legislate on these areas? Hard if we don't have people who are legislative members who have that background and experience and passion. And so I think that's one thing we need to be able to do. We need to make sure that we also have basic literacy and numeracy skills to be able to create that pipeline. I've been struck as a former educator myself of chemistry. It's very, very hard to teach a child, an 11th grader, chemistry if they don't have reading and numeracy skills, beyond the grade school level. So we have an enormous amount of work to do on creating those pathways, on investing in the talent that we need to be able to be part of that white crowd. And I agree with the ambassador, it's shades of gray as well. But I hope that we're on the right side of this as we develop the digital world that we need to see.
Are you optimistic? You sound sort of pessimistic about where we're going. I'm kind of interested in whether you think we're tilting the right direction. And you know, and I don't mean to put you on the pressure because, you know, we often hear these rah-rah speeches if we just do it. But I really want to talk to people about what building blocks we need to put in place. And it sounds like you're frustrated with the fact that we're not doing these things. And I just want to make sure I'm getting that tone right. And so I'm feeling the passion from you. But I mean, how frustrated and pessimistic are you?
So if you knew me really well, you'd know that I consider myself to be the Eeyore of the Winnie the Pooh story. So you've hit the nail on the head. But I'm also here, you know, here in Congress because I have a real passion for this. And I think people need to be running into this, you know, problem, into this fire rather than away from it. And so even though I'm an Eeyore, I'll hold some amount of optimism that we have the opportunity to change the direction that we're heading in. But I am pretty alarmed. I am really worried. It is one of the reasons why I ran for Congress and why I serve on the Foreign Affairs Committee, on the Armed Services Committee, and cyber specifically, and on the Asia Subcommittee, because I worry about Asia, the rise of China. And so I think hopefully we are asking the right questions and heading in the right direction. Yesterday, I had breakfast at the Pentagon to talk about this exact issue in the military and our concern that we really can't be quite so open about our data in the military environment. And so there's a lot of work to do, and I will continue to try and put on my Tigger hat the next time we talk.
Oh, well, I actually think you ought to start the Eeyore Caucus in Congress. I mean, you know, realism is where it's at. It's always, you know, I always thought Eeyore was underappreciated. But Fred, let me jump to you. You know, when you know, we've seen COVID ravage this country, right? We just passed 500,000 deaths. That number is probably realistically higher given the underreported side of it. It has highlighted great divides in this country, but you know, everything is digital now. We used to have the sort of analog world and the digital world. Everything is digital world. And if you're not connected in that, you're really left out. And so I'm interested, again, from the question of some of the things that Chrissy was just speaking about in terms of, you know, competency, literacy, numeracy, basic coding skills, these elements here being embedded in education as part of the human capital question, right? As we look at competitiveness in the digital world. Tell us from not only Microsoft's perspective, but Fred Humphrey's perspective about what elements you think we need to move and what kinds of steps you're taking.
Absolutely. First of all, I just need to say to the Congresswoman, my father got his PhD in physical chemistry. He was the first African-American to get his PhD in physical chemistry from the University of Pittsburgh. I got a chemistry set every year.
My parents did the same.
And then I went to law school. So just on that. And so coming from a background or a family when it comes to science, technology, engineering, and math, STEM, and I want to commend the ALI, you know, on their report where they talk about STEM, and they talk about something because he was a university president of 2 historically Black colleges and universities for 30 years, combining the two together. What we need, and they talk about it in the report, is this inclusive growth. But we just have to be serious about this comprehensive plan when it comes to education. And that means starting one of the things that many tech companies do, and we kind of boil the ocean, to be honest with you. You know, Google does X, Amazon does Y, Facebook does Z, Microsoft does other. Just small, mid-sized, you know, tech companies are doing lots of different things in education. One of the things that we do is we have a TEALS program where we do with other technology companies, and we go into the classroom and we volunteer to help teach teachers to teach computer science. That's just one aspect. When we look at what we need on the cybersecurity front, with the cybersecurity skills, we're so short on having that. That's something that a lot of community colleges and other colleges are focusing on. So we need something at the, you know, starting on that K through 12. We need something in the community colleges. We need something in the 4-year institutions, and we need to make sure, which is talked about in the ALI report, making sure we're doing the HSIs, the Hispanic serving institutions, the minority serving institutions, the HBCUs, so that we also have that inclusive educational opportunity and exposure. And the tech companies, I think, are laser focus on it. And then the last thing I would say, Steve, is that one of the things that we have done at Microsoft is we have a skilling initiative, because you have lifelong learning today. It's just so important. And it's with LinkedIn and it's with GitHub. And we embarked upon global on June, I think it was June 30th, a global initiative, right? And based upon information that we have through LinkedIn's economic graph, we know where the opportunities are. And one of the things that everybody that you see, definitely as a result of the pandemic, of retail, healthcare, so many areas been impacted. If you don't have the digital skills, you're going to get left behind to have opportunity, which is an education piece, and to make that transition. So one of the things we're offering is workforce skilling, reskilling, and upskilling type of courses and things of nature. And that's where there's a private-public partnerships need to continue to be able to make investments for people to grow and learn and have opportunities.
Fred, before I jump to Karen, and she will fix everything. She's
glad you let me go before Karen, because she's like,
yeah.
Wizard of Oz, knows all.
Yeah, I don't know if you're a competitor with them or not, but yesterday I interviewed John Stankey, who's the new CEO of AT&T. And one of the things we talked a little bit about was upskilling. And I think AT&T's employment in America is around 280,000 people, somewhere up there. It's a lot, big chunk of folks. And they have this thing called the nano degree. And the nano degree takes people who may not have those numeracy skills, who may not have some of that. And it basically takes them where they are and they brings them in to kind of give them, the first credential in this digital space that stays with them, that gives them something. And I'm wondering whether or not there's something there that when you look beyond a company, but you look at society, that we raise the level of octane, the level of the value of that entryway into this digital space, recognizing that a lot of people are not. Are you playing around in that space at all?
Absolutely. When you look at LinkedIn Learning is something that you can go do, and you get a certificate. Same thing on different Microsoft aspects, and I think I applaud what AT&T is doing, but I think you're seeing a lot of companies looking at that aspect. I serve on with 240 of my closest friends on the National Association of Manufacturing's board, and one of the things that always used to just catch my attention is that the job openings that are in small and mid-size in the manufacturing space, but it requires a technology background but a certification. You get that certification in X space, you may be talking about $120,000 a year job, in the manufacturing space, and it's a certification, aspect. So that is something that tech is focused on, not just Microsoft, other tech companies are focused on, because I don't want, it's not all about Microsoft, it's about broader tech for this
great
conversation. So yes.
Excellent. Well, I want to jump to Karen, but I had one of the panelists just said, hey, can we interrupt each other? Can this be like Whoopi Goldberg and Meghan McCain on The View? And I said, absolutely. So please go to it. But I'm going to go to Karen for a minute and ask Karen. Karen Kornblue, I should tell people, was our former ambassador to the OECD, but she also worked with me early on at the New America Foundation. She had been at Treasury. She'd been in the Clinton administration. She was one of the first conceptualizers, among those first people, to look at how broadband might transform how a lawyer works, might transform, how a think tank works. I mean, there was a time where we didn't know how transformative this world was going to be, and she laid a lot of this out. And so, Karen, you've been from the very early on as sort of a broadband diva, right? So when you kind of come along here, and then you did this OECD, and diva in my world is a very positive thing. I would just like to ask you, how well has that framing that you were a part of, has it been good for us? Where does it need to evolve that we have been had some blind spots to? And so let me get you in this and respond to Representative Houlihan, Fred, or your former colleague at Treasury, Mike Froman.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Steve. And I'm feeling optimistic. I just want to say I'm normally an Eeyore, but I have to say the amount of consensus that I think we have now around some of the issues that are raised in this fantastic report is really encouraging. And, in the last administration, there was a big emphasis on sort of the playing defense, on keeping out a lot of technologies that were coming from China and that threat. And I think the other two parts of the stool have come into view and are being embraced across the board, which is investment, as we've heard, and then also working with our allies to set up maybe some guardrails. Mike was talking about privacy, what are some of the things we want to protect, and that we're going to all in a principled way. And getting to your question, the US is going to need to step back into the leadership role that it used to have. So I was at the Federal Communications Commission when the internet was first being commercialized, and then worked for Mike actually at Treasury as the White House was coming up with a framework for how to deal with this new thing. And we really felt that, and so many people felt that just the technology itself was so democracy and innovation promoting, right? It's unfiltered, permissionless, open. It would bring democracy to the Middle East. It would, allow any girl from Tennessee to hook into the Library of Commerce and teach herself. So we had this incredible optimism, much of which was right. It did increase productivity. It did lead to lots of innovation. It did lead to great creativity and expression. But I think as time went on, the internet changed. Our whole lives went online, as Mike was saying. The digital and the analog have combined, and then concerns have arisen with privacy, with consumer protection, civil rights, hate speech, extremism, election interference. And so I think that original framework is fraying, and I think there's consensus that the US needs to step back into a leadership role as we did in the early days of the internet.
What do you think is going to be the Sputnik in this story, Karen? Because a lot of what we're talking, I'm hearing each of you talk about, the importance of this, and particularly Representative Houlihan. And I'm just, is there going to be a point at which we realize, wow, we're underinvesting? Our social stakeholders are not ramping this up as seriously as they should be. We have the Microsofts, we have labs, we have universities, but the partnerships aren't quite what some of our global competitors are investing in. At least right now they're afraid. What do you think is this? Do we need a Sputnik? Is that the wrong metaphor? But do we need a Sputnik?
Is that for me,
Karen?
I'd say that's exactly what
you were smiling and no one else was. So I thought.
No, I think that's exactly what we need. We need to package this as, so when I was at the OECD, they did a big report on innovation. And I was talking to the guy who had written it, and he said, you in the US are always, oh, woe is me. We're not what we were, but every country I go to wants a Silicon Valley. Every country wants to be the US. Don't count yourselves out. And I think we need to have that optimism, that vision, a sense of course we can do this, that we have these incredible assets. And if we just have some goals in mind, we don't have to pick winners and losers, but we can achieve great things. And I think, the public health emergency that we have, and the climate emergency that we have, and the inequity emergency that we have, and the threat of extremism, these are some things that could, each of them alone or together, could provide sort of a Sputnik kind of goal. So it doesn't have to be against another country the way Sputnik was. It can be, how can we use technology, invest in technology to achieve some bigger goal?
Let me ask Representative. Yeah, go ahead, please, Fred.
Go ahead to the representative. Go ahead.
No. I want to have somebody interrupt somebody, so go ahead.
Go ahead, Congresswoman.
I hope you're right, Karen, and that this is maybe our Sputnik moment where we have so many things, colliding and happening with COVID and with social unrest and with, kind of a reckoning. Maybe this is our opportunity where we've seen how vulnerable we are, but how promising and how big of an opportunity that we have to collectively build something better, for lack of a more creative way of talking about it. And I think right now, one of the ways I talk about this in my community, because not surprisingly, this is an easy topic to talk about in the community, is COVID, as an example, has really laid bare kind of all of our vulnerabilities and all of the things that, we knew to be true before COVID, we now understand, in front of us. And one of those things is that digital divide, is, access to data, is equity, as Mr. Humphreys was talking about, to access to that data. And so maybe this is the point at which the public, who we really need to have behind us, understands the importance of this, kind of conversation about the digital divide, the importance of making sure that we're thinking ethically about our access to information and data. I think maybe we have that moment if we can take advantage of it.
And if I could build on that, Steve, and Congresswoman actually teed it up very nicely, is that COVID has resulted in a digital acceleration that would have taken 3 to 7 years, or maybe 5 to 10 years to take place on this digital, and that's resulted in digital transformation. But it has no question, as the Congresswoman said, highlighted vulnerabilities, or opportunities for growth and opportunities to do better for community. And it's touched upon one. It really highlights the digital infrastructure that one needs. I mean, and it highlighted for all tech companies. They won't talk about it, but it's like, wow, hey, we're proud of our cloud, and others are their platforms. We got to see how much capacity that it can really have globally because of just the different aspects. You get to see, right, and it's in the report, about 40 million, I forgot how they phrased it, that don't have, they didn't call it not access to the internet, but just on the digital divide. And it's for all tech companies, and it's all throughout the world. Everybody always thinks it's just in the US. It highlighted all throughout the world where there is opportunities to growth on that infrastructure piece. And we need to make that investment on the infrastructure, which also includes devices. Now, where's that opportunity from that Sputnik or whatever? I am a glass half full that this administration has an incredible opportunity. We continue to lead on innovation. There's so much opportunities on AI and other different opportunities, but there's another issue: deployment and data. And we need to get with allies. We need to get with the T10, I think, is now the new thing. I look to the ambassador, both ambassadors on it, of just working together on this technology piece. And then I think there can be some great opportunities, because in a place like China, they roll something out, it's 1 billion people, they get data, they get information, they learn. They further their technology agenda. Can't just do that in the US. There needs to be a strengthening from a competitive perspective with other countries on it when it comes to technology advancements, and have those breakthrough moments.
That's great, Fred. Let me ask Mike a question. There was I should mention that Karen Kornblue, of course, is with the German Marshall Fund, and at the German Marshall Fund's Brussels Forum a few years back, I interviewed Europe's minister for a single digital economy. And we got into a question. It was very interesting. This fellow was from Estonia, very sort of pro-American, sort of sad for America falling behind at certain things in his view. But he said, and I asked him, I said, what about Google, Twitter, Facebook, these, the Microsoft, these sort of large innovative firms? What do you have in Europe? And he says, no, we need you to be the innovators. We're the regulators. We was right on the eve of GDPR. I wrote down that the General Data Protection Regulations, GDPR, being implemented, and said, look, you innovate, we regulate. And this was an on-the-record comment at Brussels Forum, so I can say this. But I think that the question, Mike, is as we sit and talk about digital policy, is there an element where we're missing the unique combustion that happens in the American innovation base that others may not have, that we need to be careful of not over-regulating? I mean, you've kind of sprawl the world in what you do, but is there an element that we're missing in this discussion where Europe can't do what we're doing, even China can't do what we're doing, or is that a mistaken bit of hubris?
So first of all, Steve, I have to disagree with you. I think Karen is much more of a digital maven than a digital diva in this regard.
She's not a maven.
She's been that for all of us here. But I think you're exactly right. In the conversation that you've just been having, I think the glass is more than half full when it comes to our capacity to innovate, and the fact that so many of the great digital companies, including Microsoft and the digital platforms, are started in the United States. It's a reflection of a lot of unique elements of our system that promote that innovation. Very hard to replicate Silicon Valley and other parts of the world. Doesn't mean that there isn't really interesting innovation going on there, but the unique ecosystem we have here is really outstanding. What I worry about, though, and it goes to your question, is our innovation, our technology solutions are leaping ahead much faster than our regulatory, governmental, and social consensus that's necessary for them to ultimately prosper. We have a real trust deficit out there in society, and we have to be proactive about rebuilding or building a series of trusted networks so that people feel comfortable in the digital economy, feel comfortable with how their data is being used or their control over that data. I have to give credit to the European Union. I think they have been on the front foot and have been ahead of the rest of the world when it comes to issues like privacy regulation. And the consumer principles of GDPR, now we're applying them as a company globally, regardless of what the regulatory situation is. I think they have set a standard that the rest of the world is now moving towards. I think what we have to be careful of, what the Europeans have to be careful of, is going from there to a series of regulations that could actually stifle the innovation that we're all hoping to see out of the digital economy. And that's where I think the proposals like the T10 or proposals like a data and technology forum or some of these other ideas that are out there that aren't necessarily about coming up with global regulation, but avoiding the balkanization of the internet, the creation of national clouds, the archipelago of regulations that could go on, at least some capacity to come together and coordinate approaches is going to be very, very important. And then putting on my old trade hat, there's a lot of interesting work that's gone on in TPP, in USMCA, in US-Japan, in agreements that Singapore is negotiating with Australia, New Zealand, and South Korea and elsewhere, that I think could become the foundation of raising standards among like-minded countries in this area to ensure that we strike that right balance between regulation, which is critical to restoring trust, and promoting innovation.
Thank you, Representative Houlihan. I am sitting here, every day I'm looking at what the Biden administration is rolling out, and among those things eventually will be some set of activities around infrastructure. Again, talking to John Stankey yesterday, our discussion was about closing the digital divide, which has become an opportunity divide. It's become a lifestyle divide. It's become a survival divide in this country, which I know Fred has also been working a lot on. And I'm just wondering if there is a serious effort to begin through wireless and fiber and others to address the lack of connectivity for a significant number of Americans, both urban and rural, whether or not that can become packaged with other elements of this, like digital competency, what you were talking about, design a national plan. And so, you are reserve in the military, and I've learned my own military experience. You're either a strategist and anticipate the threat and plan for it, or you're a reactive type that just waits for the threat to come in. So when you kind of think as a strategist, is that infrastructure and digital connection piece of the story an opportunity to package, a larger strategic plan around our digital future?
I think that's a really good question and impression, and it actually has given me something to think about. That being said, as a freshman, now sophomore in Congress, what I can tell you is we're not very good about thinking outside of silos. And so when we think in Congress about infrastructure, I don't think that we are capable of thinking in the way that you're thinking, which is more broadly about how to piece it together across disciplines, so to speak. I do think that we have gotten the attention of the Congress in the importance of broadband and 5G and infrastructure with those words. I think that we will be able to move forward on an infrastructure package. not necessarily called an infrastructure package, but maybe some sort of a stimulus package that includes something like 5G and other infrastructure in it. But I don't think I would hold my breath that we would include kind of other equity issues or other digital literacy issues as an example in that package, mostly because, to be really honest with you, I think that what's going to happen with an infrastructure package will be this reconciliation process again. And because it's this reconciliation process that we're going through right now with the COVID relief, it needs to have a noticeable effect on the budget. And those kinds of things don't necessarily have a noticeable effect on the budget. It doesn't mean that we can't still push for them. I think that we really need to make sure that we're thinking about how we make sure to get broadband to everybody. I agree with Mr. Humphreys that we have seen just a huge sea change in terms of our understanding of the importance of digital information and access to broadband. I think that this is not just, accelerating us by decades. I don't think we would have ever gotten here had there not been a pandemic. I think that the inertia that is there would not have allowed us to propel ourselves into this place where we now understand that we can have conferences like this. I came to Congress a couple years ago and asked my chief if we could have our meetings across the district and in Washington, D.C. via Zoom. And you would have thought I had 10 heads. This was not something that was possible. And now we have a pandemic and we can, the technology isn't different. We just are different now. And so
the power of inertia.
Exactly.
Power of inertia.
Exactly.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah,
Let me ask.
I have hope.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, please.
No problem. I'm done.
So I'm going to ask all of you, quick question. I want to remind everyone that you can pose questions. We've got some good questions already from Paula Stern and Luisa Tomar. I guess it's in the Q&A box down at the bottom. I'm going to get to questions soon. But Karen, you've written a little bit about the need for democracies to come together and think through a lot of this stuff, digital allies, and it's made me think about, again, going back to the old days, 20 years ago, of globalization and how it was going to solve, we're going to have a borderless world. Well, borders are back, right? Competition is back. And I'm just wondering, Fred Humphrey's colleague, Brad Smith, wrote this book called Tools and Weapons and said, technology can be used for bad purposes, and Microsoft walked away from helping China on its facial recognition software programs and its, whatnot. So I'm just interested in how close are we to an internet where there was really open to a splinter net? When you look at ripping Huawei infrastructure out of communications infrastructure in this area, I just wonder whether or not we're going to end up with a world that's very balkanized in this, and what that means for industry, what that means for, when I see something like, let's work with democracies, I'm not sure democracies are the form of government spreading in the world. Was it due to the American market power of firms like Microsoft? So I just love to kind of hear any brainstorming thoughts all of you have on this dystopian fear of mine, that as we look at values being connected to this, we could end up with a very splintered universe when it comes to digital platforms. Karen?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. It's really important that we articulate the answer to that very well. I think what we're thinking about, those of us, many people are thinking about, how can democracies work together? It's to preserve a global open internet. It's to stop exactly what you're talking about. And the fear is, and this has been true since, the Obama administration, China, Russia, Iran, were looking for some kind of switch they could turn to protect their domestic sphere from the free speech and expression that the internet provided. That's one of the reasons when that we used the OECD, but we brought in multi-stakeholder participants to have these internet policymaking principles that said, you know what, UN, you stay out of this. We don't want you to give the ITU as part of the UN. They were going to, they were debating whether or not to give countries the ability, like they could with in the old days with their telecoms networks, to cut off access and result in that balkanization you're talking about, that splinter net. And we said, we're going to work in a multi-stakeholder environment, and we're going to put out some principles for the internet that should be open, respect human rights, but that individual countries can do things to protect legitimate policy concerns, like privacy, consumer protection, and so on, intellectual property. And we need to get back to articulating that that's what we mean. When the democracies come together, we don't mean we're going to have a democratic internet and we're going to leave people who live under authoritarian regimes, on their own without access to anything. We want to ensure that they have access to open internet as well. So I'm also chair of something called the Open Technology Fund that comes out of that Obama administration impetus towards an open internet. And they get funded by the government to help people all over the world evade surveillance, this pernicious surveillance. It's getting more and more sophisticated, as well as censorship. Yeah.
Right. Cool. Michael, your thoughts?
Well, I think Karen has talked really about the scariest, the most Eeyore element of this, which is, of course, cutting off the internet for your people as a form of political control. But there are lots of things that are going on right now, even sometimes among democracies, that is beginning to lead to that balkanization. And oftentimes they're motivated by very legitimate policy concerns. To be frank, sometimes they're motivated by less legitimate concerns, protectionism, or wanting to stick a finger in the eye of another country, or create an unlevel playing field for domestic players, things of that sort. And I think we need to be equally cognizant of that. And I'll just give you one example from MasterCard. You probably all have gotten warnings of fraud or something on your phone when it looks like you have an unusual transaction or something like that. Our ability to find patterns of cyber intrusion is because we can see transactions all over the world. And when we see a pattern that is emerging in Nigeria, Ukraine, the Philippines, and Houston, we say, aha, this is a new form of cyber intrusion. Let's get on it right away, warn all of our banks, warn all of the customers, make sure that they can't get into the network. When you have balkanized internet and you can only see one country's transactions at a time, you can't make those comparisons. You can't see those patterns. And we've saved countries over $50 billion in cyber theft because of the ability to see the free flow of data. And this is aggregated data, anonymized data. It's not sensitive data. It's not about personal privacy. Being able to preserve those kinds of benefits. I just use that as one example. I'm sure Microsoft's got a million examples like this and others about how the open digital economy creates value. Being able to preserve that while addressing, again, those legitimate concerns like privacy and consumer protection, IP and others. I think that's really the critical piece.
Fred, let me jump to you and then to Congresswoman Houlihan, and then I'm going to open to questions. And I want to remind people that Representative Houlihan has to hard stop at 10:15, even though she's had a great time today, I think. Fred?
I just want to echo and say ditto to what Karen said, build on what Mike said and a couple other comments Mike said. And the MasterCard example is just spot on, and would have many just Microsoft examples. And I want to pick up on something you said on the, you think about those that have democracies. One of the things, and all of us, quite frankly, have global insights, is that you're saying is with democracies and those that are more authoritarian aspects, it's privacy, it's security, it's national security, it's all these other different things. And I think at its core, particularly for companies that are based and domiciled in the U.S., when you're in these other countries, democracies are not, as we are do business in 180 countries, is trust. That trust factor is there. And then something that a lot of tech companies don't necessarily always want to embrace. We want the freedom to innovate and different things. We got to just figure out globally, what are the rules of the road there to be able to foster that continue with the innovation, to continue to be that aspect, because everybody wants access to the data. I'm sorry. I mean, even those who you would say, not supposed to do the white hat, black hats, but even if those would you say white hat countries, just aspects, and this balkanization stuff is real. And I think it's with this nationalism and some of the different things that take place. So one of the things that I just feel good about with the Biden administration is how do you do that outreach and to build that back up in places. In some places, it's just going to be very difficult, which is why companies like ourselves, we don't have data centers in certain places.
Right. So Representative Houlihan, let me get your perspective to jump in on this, but let me piggyback a little bit, because as I look at this, a lot of, I don't want to critique your colleagues, but a lot of legislators, who get concerned about global behaviors, oh, we should cut this off, we should sanction this, we should do whatever. But at the same time, if you end up with a world where America's own firms have less access to the world, they'll have less market presence, it ends up having very significant downstream consequences. And I'll just be blunt about it. If China ends up with much more of, the future global middle class than the United States does, it throws us into an interesting challenge, which means, in my book, trying to get some of this stuff right with China on the front end is very important, because at the end of the day, they may have more of this growing market than US and European firms do. So I'd just be interested in whether that is the way you see it, and what your colleagues, some of your colleagues kind of jump in very rapidly and may not be thinking about some of these downstream consequences.
So I'm gonna try and do my best to sort of frame, you mentioned that I'm a vet, and my dad and my grandfather too. So I come from sort of a military family, and to your point, strategy, winning the war before it starts is really, really important. And so even though I want to make sure that I present as somebody who wants to work with other allies, and I still also very much would like to make sure that we're a lead factor in this, that the United States is a lead factor in this. And so going back to another analogy of mine, some pigs are more equal than others. All pigs are equal, Animal Farm, George Orwell. So I'd like to see that, make sure that we are that leader and that beacon of light and ethics and morality. This goes to the reason why I'm aiming at that is that my colleagues are in many cases not people who, as I mentioned, have this kind of background, or as I mentioned, are open-minded to having this kind of education, which is why we need more people in places like this that have this kind of background. I'll give you a really horrifying fact. You talk about our national presence or international presence. People who apply to the State Department right now are not allowed to have STEM degrees in many cases. They are precluded from being considered as candidates for those jobs. They are required to have liberal arts degrees to be in many of the State Department's jobs. If you're thinking about our presence on the planet and how we navigate our, and present ourselves in these issues that are so important and so worrisome and so exciting, these are the kinds of problems that we have that are systemic things that we need to fix. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is we just need more people in the pipeline who have this kind of background. And we need to, even small tweaks like legislating that State Department employees can have STEM backgrounds is a really important step to be taking. And then I guess I will end, because I know I've taken too much time, but I think that we just need to be thinking really hard about kind of our opportunity and our role to be forward-leaning in the way that I think Europe has been. I think that we've missed the opportunity so far.
Well, thank you. It's been, go ahead. Yes, please.
No, I was going to say this has been phenomenal. I've really enjoyed it, but we have a lot of really good questions from the audience, and I'm going to throw a couple out and then really let you guys go at it. Question actually from Nelson Cunningham. What, in terms of U.S. policy, including industrial policy and USG spending, is needed to create 5G hardware alternatives to Huawei? And then a question from Sherry.
Well, why don't we jump on that and jump in, because we want to. But Karen, how do we solve? I mean, Nelson's question is like very important. Got Ericsson and Nokia,
Nelson,
European firm, Samsung. Yeah, so I'd love to know what Nelson's answer to this is, but what is your answer and Fred's answer? We don't have an American counterpart to Huawei or Ericsson or Nokia or Samsung. So in that, how do we get that deficit in the 5G story fixed?
One of the things I think is so interesting is that we're talking about industrial policy. The President Biden's appointees I've actually talked about an industrial policy, and I think we have to think about what that means in some of the context that we've been talking about today. I don't think anybody means that we should be picking winners and losers, that we should be saying, that company, is our national champion and we're going to cut out its competitors. Because I think we've learned that that is just not a recipe for success. But we do need to worry about a supply chain of critical technologies that are enabling. And I think we think that 5G is an enabling technology. And so we need to have a supply chain that is secure, that is open, and so on. And so one of the things that the Trump administration did was work to try to get our allies not to buy Chinese technology. And I think what the shift is how do we build up our capabilities with our allies? So it's not just the US, it's working with European providers, it's working with Taiwanese semiconductor manufacturers. How do we work with a trusted supply chain and build that up and make investments? So it's not just defense, it's also investment, innovation, and again, leading with these values. It's not that we don't like that country's company or we want to, we're mercantilist, as you said, digital mercantilist. It's that we value security, privacy, openness, and so on. And so we need a supply chain that meets that. But again, this is where we come down to, it's not going to be a national industrial policy. It's going to be a pro-innovation, bottom-up, values-led with our allies.
Right. Let me ask Chrissy Houlihan to comment because I know she has to go, but I would also say today is Biden's supply chain day. So we can go look at what he's initiating and putting on the table today and kick the tires of it, see if it's real or not. But Representative Houlihan, and I want to thank you in advance. You've been fantastic in the conversation. I know you have to run, but I hope you'll come back many more to ALI programs.
Thank you for having me. It was really nice to be with you guys. I look forward to seeing you in what I hope is the real world and warmer and better weather and better days. Talk to you guys later. Thank you so much for having me. Thank
you so much. Fred, Mike, any quick responses to Nelson Cunningham before Orit's next question?
I would just say, and again, Karen's the expert here, but I would say that as we think about our role as an innovator and our investment in R&D and the like, we need to be thinking about 6G and what the next generation is going to be, because we may have, as I understand it, may have limited success in getting countries to pull out their 5G equipment since it's based on some of their 4G backbone. But as we think about whatever,
my understanding, Mike, is that Microsoft owns 6G already. They patented it. It's software, not hardware. But I think, Fred, are you fixing this geopolitical problem?
I am not taking the bait, Clemens. I've done enough of these with you. I want to go back to your call of the question. Totally agree with what Karen is talking about. But what we are seeing, Microsoft is getting engaged on 5G virtualization, as well as working with other companies that are doing that. And you're seeing other companies do that. And we'll see where that goes. But I think that could be an interesting opportunity and interesting if there's a possibility, even a little bit of a leapfrog aspect. But we're going to see stuff like that take place and evolve.
Excellent. Ori?
That's great. So another really softball question from Sandra Pulaski. How do we deal with the incitement of violence and hate on the internet?
That's Karen.
Oh, Steve. Again, I think the administration is taking a really thoughtful approach to this. So they have Josh Geltzer, who came from Georgetown, who's a real expert in this, working through the NSC to develop a strategy on that. We saw Judge Garland talking about this at his hearing this week. They're going to take it really seriously. I think my guess is they'll look at enforcement. And I think a lot of the issues we see on the internet where we get into some big debate about should we regulate the internet or not can really be solved with enforcement of some of our offline laws in the online environment. So we have offline rules about incitement to violence, about terrorism, et cetera. And I think we need to apply those in the online world. We also have about targeted harassment. We may need to update some of these for the online environment. We may need to tweak some of the protections of the internet to make sure that we can do that kind of enforcement. But I think that's going to be a lot of it. And then I do think that there's a lot of stuff that is legal, but harmful. And there, I think the platforms need to come together and figure out how to be more transparent and more consistent in what their policies are.
I don't know if Fred and Mike want to jump in, but there's another dimension to this, which we haven't had enough time to get into, which is how certain nefarious players that are not individuals, but they are organized interests or they are nations, try to use divisive hate speech and slander as a way to divide a democracy. And I think the whole question of security and accountability is still another big topic out there that needs to be dealt with. But I'm just sort of looking at, some of what, various hacking groups out of China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, other problematic nations are doing. And, we often think about, penetrating grids with malware, but it's also penetrating our own discussions with, and I've been subject to some of them, but, just some of this hate speech. So it's not just us. There's an element where it is us, but there's also an element where people are tweaking and pushing these buttons. Fred, Mike, any quick comments on that? No. Orit, next.
Yeah, so another question along similar lines from Luisa Tomar. How can we, that a lot of the tech innovations has led to private growth and innovation, but not really towards public good, healthy civic engagement. How do we advance and incentivize STEM innovation that's pro-humanity, pro-democracy, pro-privacy, and kind of not the Silicon surveillance capitalism at this point?
Can I jump in on
Mike?
that, Steve?
Yeah, please.
I think we talk a lot about digital divides, and it means
right.
different things in different contexts. But one digital divide that we're seeing is the tremendous advancement in data science in the private sector, and how governments, local, national governments, nonprofit organizations, civic organizations are falling behind. And one of the things I think is really useful to focus on is how do we create a field around data science for social impact and bring together the tremendous strengths of the private sector in this area, or the advancements in the private sector, with some of the big social and economic challenges we face. It's something we launched a project with the Rockefeller Foundation called data.org, which has that as its goal, which is how do you build capacity? As the Congresswoman was saying, how do you make sure there are people, members of Congress and congressional staff, who are fully conversant on the issues of data science and can apply data science to the policy issues that they're wrestling with. In the Obama administration, we had the launch of the U.S. Digital Service. How do we make sure that we're integrating some of the tools and capabilities of data science being developed in the private sector in government policy making and evaluation? And the other way around, how do we make sure that data scientists, wherever they're working, have greater sensitivity to issues around the public good, issues around privacy, issues around trust, that they're integrating that? And I think there's a lot of work to be done with our universities and other lifelong learning possibilities to really bring those two communities together.
Great. Fred, thoughts on trust building in this world?
Real easy question. I mean, it's a part of every day as a company on how do you conduct yourself, and it's in Microsoft, when I think about trust building, it's like responsible AI and outlining what your values are and principles are. It's being a good steward of the data. It's when you're in 180 countries. When you get a law enforcement request that you're a little concerned about, like, what is the purpose of this? Is say, you know what, we're going to fight this in court and we're going to take it until it's exhausted because we believe in the rule of law and follow it. but we're not going to just turn this over. It's a whole bunch of different things, and it's also being a responsible company that has, good values. We talk about the values. The values end up equating to building trust. So it's a lot of different things that are expected of companies. I'm sure Mike can relate to that as, in the financial world, or you look at MasterCard and its reputation, it's about all these different things that build upon trust that are key.
Right. Reed?
Well, I'll just there were a number of questions that really talked about how we expand, how we really implement diversity in STEM. Both, someone raised the question of how do we implement diversity of STEM in the military, and I think just around, there was a question about women in technology, and across the board. I think, it's one thing to say that it's a good goal, which I think everyone agrees, and I think it's another thing to really get down to the nuts and bolts and figure out how to actually do it. So I'm just going to see what people say.
Can I jump in on this? And then I want to go to Karen and everybody, and we'll use this as the final one. I have done a lot on the question of diversity and inclusion, and I know particularly, individuals of color, outstanding women scientists, they are out there. And I asked each one of them, how did you become you? And each one of them had early exposure to science, to STEM, to problem solving, and mentors. And so that tells me that it's not impossible to do it, but there's an absence of young exposure to science and STEM and experience, and an absence of mentors, when it comes to the broad diversity. But I just feel like this is a fixable and doable problem if people are serious about it. I don't believe we are serious enough about addressing this, but it is you can talk to just anyone in this film, from Franz Cordova to Ellen Stofan, Karen Turner, who heads the Ventnor Institute. All of them are profound scientists out there, and you kind of talk to them and say what it mattered was something young, and then somebody mentoring them. Fred, this is a big obsession of mine, and I just find we talk it, we don't walk it. Your thoughts?
This is a personal passion of mine, and being, as I indicated earlier, raising a home where my father, university president of Florida A&M, one Tennessee State University, another, raised on a Berkeley Black College, and PhD in physical chemistry. All he talked about is STEM, STEM, STEM. And I just want to tell you, if companies or organizations are serious about it, it's really not that hard. Yes, you need to make some investments and do something. And ever since George Floyd, I'm on the board of Morehouse College. I'm a proud Morehouse College graduate.
Yeah.
Money just came pouring in. They want to give to an HBCU. I'll get myself in trouble as I say this. White guilt, it's a powerful thing of wanting to give resources. That's great. We'll take it. But at the same time, it's about meaningful investments to go nurture, recruit, bring in, retain, create that opportunity. There's so much out there if you want to do it, and it means getting into different communities. So it's just a matter of just making the real commitment.
I just
know how to do this if they want to do it. And I think that I am a glass half full. We'll see that commitment out of this administration, and I think that people are getting more serious. For some reason, after George Floyd, there's this thing where people are woke, as they say.
Right. Well, we could get a snapshot from Mike, and I'm going to give last word to Karen, who I know has worked a lot on this as well. Mike Froman?
Well, look, I agree with Fred. I think it's just got to be a concerted effort at all levels. And I think the more that corporations are being asked to disclose details on diversity and inclusion in their workforce, the more they're measuring it themselves. Sometimes they hadn't measured it to know where they stood. And the more that we can do to be proactive. We run a program called Girls for Tech, which is about getting girls into STEM, starting at age 8. We've now done 1 million girls. We've got a goal of having 5 million girls. But lots of other programs like that. And in fact, Microsoft and us and Workday have a program of training people to do cybersecurity, go into the government, go into the private sector, forgive their student loans. There's just a lot of things that companies can do if they make it a priority, start measuring it, and be concerted about it.
All right, Karen, thank you, Mike. Karen, I'm gonna give you the last word on this, and we just have like 2 minutes, but I know that this has been also, whether you're in your Council on Foreign Relations work, your kind of global work, OECD, just give us a snapshot of what we need to do to fix this problem. And, I just am aware, because OECD data, it's just different in other countries. They're
Right.
better than we are.
Well, I think one of the things that, one of the themes of this conversation has been trust. And I think we have to think of this issue of diversity, and as you're raising it, not just diversity in terms of who in the United States is incorporated, but as others have talked about, what other countries are incorporated into this open global digital world that we're hurtling into, is that it can't be good. It's not going to be as efficient. It's not going to be as innovative. We're not going to get the same creativity if we don't have everybody at the table and everybody involved. And so I think we have to start seeing it as a mainstream concern, an excellence concern. If you're cutting out major portions of the population from being involved in this, you're not going to get as good a result for anyone. We're all going to lose. And until we have that shift of mindset,
Right.
we're not going to do good work if we have only one kind of person with culture fit around the table. They're going to miss a bunch of the consumers, a bunch of the problems, a bunch of the huge risks, which is what we're seeing now. We're not going to make this thing trustworthy if we don't have everybody at the table.
So that's a fabulous note to end on. Thank you to all the panel. You guys have just done a fabulous job, and this has just been an incredible discussion. Really, really fascinating, laying out a lot of the issues. It's complicated, but I'm also inspired to hear a lot of the energy and solutions that you all proposed. Thank you very much for joining us, and really hope to have you all back for a future program. I think we could have gone on discussing
Fred, Mike,
this.
and Karen.
Thank
and
you.
Chrissy Houlihan. Thank you all.
And to those people, we are collecting all questions that we didn't have time to ask, and we're going to do our best to follow up. So thank you again. Panel 1, please turn your cameras off. And I see that we already have panel 2 with us, so I'm going to go ahead and ask you guys to turn your cameras on. Wendy, turn your camera on. Wonderful. Thank you, everybody, and welcome. And so we're now going to talk about, our second panel is about, we talked about the domestic arena. We're now going to talk about America leading globally. This panel is really going to look at how America should engage with its allies regarding digital governance, the challenges, were posed by China's technology practices. And once again, I'm going to give the audience time to ask Q&A at the end of the panel. And again, audience, feel free to join us on the Q&A or on Twitter with hashtag Global Digital Strategy or hashtag ALI. So again, we have a phenomenal panel lined up, and everybody should have their bios, and they're on the ALI website. But our panel starts with 2 amazing congresswomen. And actually, I was just thinking that we've had 3 congresswomen on this program, which just delights me to no end. But Congresswoman Susan DelBene is from Washington State. She serves on the House Ways and Means Committee, Trade Subcommittee, and is the new chair of the New Democrat Coalition. And really a leader on digital trade. Congresswoman Stephanie Murphy is on House Ways and Means and Armed Services, has a great background in national security issues, and represents the state of Florida. We have former Wendy Cutler, who is the vice president of the Asia Society Policy Institute and acting deputy U.S. Trade Representative under President Obama, And last, but certainly not least, Scott Kennedy, who is Senior Fellow and Director of the CSIS Center on China Business and Economics. And unfortunately, this morning, our moderator, Jeremy Bash, had a family medical emergency. So was not able, unfortunately, is not able to be with us. So I am going to do my best to channel Jeremy. I'm sure I won't be as charming as he is, but we have such a great panel that I think it'll go fine. So I'm just going to give a couple introductory words and just say that, you know, I think we all agree that the first step to the U.S. becoming a global leader really starts at home. And as our first panel really ably laid out. But, you know, the next step really is, and I think even the first panel touched on this quite a bit, you know, that we need to lead globally. And I think that as the digital economy has skyrocketed, especially over the past year, international collaboration regarding that economy has really lagged behind. You know, we've had small groups of countries, you know, that have negotiated agreements that have had some digital provisions, whether it's USMCA or, you know, Singapore, Australia, Chile, et cetera. But global digital governance is really still lacking. And the US, you know, which I think we all know has historically been the architect of global governance writ large, has largely been absent from this stage over the past 4 years. So, you know, into this vacuum, many countries have enacted a variety of restrictive digital regulatory and trade measures, you know, which have really limited the ability of their citizens to benefit from the internet and limited the ability of companies to do business in those countries. China, of course, has used the digital restrictions to censor the internet and monitor and control its citizens. And I think of even greater concern is the fact that when China sells its subsidized equipment, they sell with it, or they bring with it their authoritarian vision of the internet and including the means to censor and monitor and suppress citizens. So I think, you know, at ALI, and, you know, we talked about this in our report, the time really is now for the US to step up as a 21st century global digital leader. And I think, you know, the Biden administration is already taking some really encouraging steps in this direction. But the first step really is to repair relations with our allies and start to develop a consensus around global governance issues such as privacy, taxation, standards, protection of key technologies, as well as how to collaborate to address China's policies. This is really critical. We don't want the world to splinter into different regulatory blocks and stifle commercial growth. The US also needs to lead in standard setting. You know, in our absence, China has really taken a leadership role in many of these areas, particularly of concern, you know, looking at new technologies, whether it's artificial intelligence, facial recognition. You know, we want to make sure that we come up with standards that protect consumers and protect human rights. And we want to make sure that our vision of the internet as accountable, open, and democratic prevails globally. So I'm now first going to turn to our members of Congress to get their thoughts on these issues and what measures, if any, Congress may take on any of these issues. So I'm going to ask Congresswoman Del Bene to say a few words, followed by Congresswoman Murphy. I'm then going to get Scott's thoughts on how to handle China and how the new administration should handle China, and then really move to Wendy, who is going to really talk about the impact on the rest of Asia and how we need to approach the rest of Asia to deal with this issue. So, Congresswoman Del Bene.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. It's great to be here with you, and I'm excited that we're here to talk about this incredibly important topic. It couldn't come at a better time because we're behind, and so we have a lot of work to do to catch up. We know that there's over 4.6 billion people online around the world. And so about 60% of the world's population, that continues to grow rapidly. But, and it's not, we'll talk a lot about policy and technology policy, but it's part of everything we do. And so I think it's important as we look at every issue, we understand that there is a digital component that could have an impact. And I say we're behind, and you started by saying that it starts here at home. We haven't looked at a lot of policy to keep up to date here at home, and that does impact the policy that we would put together or the standards that we would lead globally. We haven't updated the Electronic Communications Privacy Act to make sure that we have a warrant standard on emails. That's from a bill that passed in 1986, and we're still working to update that. When we talk about digital governance, I think a strong first step needs to be a federal consumer data privacy bill. We saw the European Court of Justice strike down the Privacy Shield. We know that if we are going to really talk about digital trade, we have to talk about cross-border data flows and how data is handled, yet we still don't have a federal data privacy protections in place. And in the absence of those protections, it's hard to say what our policy would be at the international table. And so I do think that privacy is a key starting place. I introduced federal data privacy legislation, and we'll reintroduce that again soon. Again, because we not only need those protections here in the United States, but we need to know what our policy is if we are going to help set those global standards and really have a seat at the international table. And again, I believe we're behind. And you talked about privacy and taxation, things like that, even things like digital goods as we look at digital services taxes and conversations at the OECD. Another area where we have not always been clear on how we look at digital goods in tax policy. And so we're, again, behind. So trade is digital. We finally we're a party to a digital chapter. I helped start the Digital Trade Caucus for this reason, because we need to educate people on how important these issues are. And we know that whether it's the EU, India, Indonesia, and of course China have different versions of what a digital framework should look like. And so we have to be at the table. We are leaders here. And if we're going to set global norms and standards, it starts here at home. So I'm hopeful that under this new administration that we will start down that path and make sure that we have a seat and are leading at the global table, and think that we have a lot of work to do in Congress, but in the administration, but together I think we can take an important step forward. Thanks. You're muted. Yep.
Thank you. Thank you, Congresswoman. And now I'm going to turn to Congresswoman Murphy to hear your thoughts.
Great. Thank you so much, Orit. I'm really grateful to be here, really excited to be here with my friend and colleague, Susan, and with Wendy and Scott. I'm really, I'm really glad that ALI has called on American leaders to really take a strategic look at crafting a digital strategy that includes both a domestic component and a global component. And as Susan said, you have to have the domestic piece in order to lead globally. And so it's really important that both of those elements. And I know this panel is focused on the global piece of the strategy, and that some others will be talking a bit about China. But I think, I share the concern that we are competing with China across a lot of different realms, and this digital realm is no real exception. And I always talk about how this is a moment where the United States we are in this battle with China, not just, it's sort of a meta level battle of whether or not our values and our systems win out. And in the tech world, it looks at through the form of, our technology encompasses our democratic values. Our technology has a democratizing effect, whereas China's technology has an authoritarian lens to it, a lens that allows it to create dystopias like it has in Xinjiang and in other places. And so in this battle, we have to prevail. Our democratic values and our approach to technology has to prevail. And that means that we have to make a number of investments domestically in order to be able to lead globally. But I think the other thing that's important too is that another real big reason why America needs a digital strategy is so that we can improve quality of life and reduce inequities and promote opportunity here in the United States. So it's not just about this competition of democracies versus autocratic systems. It's also about making the necessary investments in education and training and closing the digital divide and upgrading broadband and reforming our immigration laws to be able to attract talent into this industry. We have to do all of those things because it makes America stronger and it has the ability to make the lives of Americans better. So I think too that there's a few things I just wanted to highlight in the ALI report. And I know, Orit, you had a heavy hand in writing this, but some of the ideas that I really love and I think we could move out on. First, I love the idea of US building a coalition of like-minded technology democracies called the T10 or whatever the number ends up being, to basically advance our vision of a free and open internet and to counter China's version of an autocratic internet. And also it gives us an opportunity to coordinate efforts when it comes to data privacy or export controls or supply chain measures, cybersecurity, technology standards. It goes on and on. But I think that is a real key component to winning this battle of values and ideas. And it enables us to do so with allies, because I think alliances are force multipliers. And although the last administration believed in America first, well, America first, okay, but America alone, no, right? And that creates a nice construct for engaging with other countries that share our values. And then another idea that I really love too, and it's something that I have been talking a lot about. It's not very sexy, but I really love the recommendation that the US government increase the resources it devotes to international standard setting bodies. So particularly in the last administration, we weren't showing up for a lot of events at multinational or international stages. And when we're not there, there are huge delegations of Chinese representatives there. And the people who sit at the table get to set the standards. And to date, I think the world, because we have always been so engaged, we have been setting the standards, whether you look at the way our electricity is done or, our products. We've been such a big player, both as a consumer and a producer of these consumer goods. And then we've shown up to set the standards that a lot of the world has adopted American-based standards, which cares about consumers and safety and all of these things. Well, in many ways, because we are not showing up at these standard-setting bodies in these days, especially around the tech areas of technology, we are ceding that ground to the Chinese. And so they get to play a large role in setting global tech standards around things like AI and the Internet of Things. So we absolutely have to show up. And if we don't, then we can't really complain that the standards don't reflect our interest or our values. And I think that's such a simple thing for us to do, to be able to export our standards and values, but also to lead globally. And then finally, Susan and I sit on the Ways and Means Subcommittee on Trade. And I, for one, have expressed a lot of major concerns about US trade policy, especially in the Asia Pacific over the last 4 years. I think President Trump's unilateral withdrawal from TPP was a geostrategic mistake of the highest order. I always say that our presence in the Asia Pacific cannot only be through the Seventh Fleet. We have to have a strong economic presence there. And, he withdrew from TPP without a real conversation around it or a consideration of what we lose out by doing that. And, I think that deal, maybe with some modifications, would have really helped American workers and American businesses. And it definitely would have served as a counterweight to China. So, that's something that I'm hopeful the Biden administration will do a top to bottom review of our trade policy in Asia within a broader lens of our national security and our foreign policy goals in that region. And as part of this, I like the ALI's recommendation that the US should try to seek to negotiate a Pacific digital agreement to be able to set the high standards and kind of rebuild trust in the region, show that we're re-engaging with the region. There was a lot of other things to like in the report, but I'll stop there and really look forward to the discussion.
Thank you. I'm going to circle back to both of you later on because, of course, one question that looms large in my mind is, what is the capacity in, the inclination and capacity in Congress, to pass federal privacy legislation or to increase, devote more resources to standard body and all these kinds of things. But right now we're going to turn to Scott and hear a little bit about how the US should be re-engaging with China, especially around technology. And then I know Wendy will have some thoughts on negotiating with the Pacific.
Sure. Well, Orit, thank you, and to ALI for having me participate in today's event. It's a real pleasure. A lot of times I spend my time working on things which are urgent or important. Today I get to work on something that is both urgent and important. And I want to congratulate ALI on the report and on today's event. And I think this shows actually the degree of consensus building around the analysis of what the challenges is, as well as what the solutions are. So I think actually we're going to have a sort of a chorus here, all going in the same direction instead of a bunch of arguments, which is actually important and suggests that we ought to be optimistic, even though this is a daunting task. I believe there was someone who once said, and you all will be able to help me, they said something like, if we don't set the rules, China will. I think someone might have said that, right? Now it's, if we don't set the rules, China is setting the rules. It's present tense, right? They are setting the rules. And so China's state capitalist authoritarian system is doing a lot, both on the commercial side and on the governance side. So China's got a huge, rapidly growing digital commerce industry with a great deal of talent, a lot of it globally trained, with a lot of money behind it, leaping ahead in all sorts of kinds of industries. There's some areas of technology where the Chinese are still far behind in commercial aircraft and in semiconductors themselves, but in the use of data, they are world leaders. And in the governance of data, they are playing a monster role. Congresswoman Murphy just mentioned their advocacy of internet sovereignty and how that conflicts with our values. I think people here are familiar with China's social credit system and basically the vacuum approach to picking up everybody's data, domestic and foreign, and what that means for people's rights. China's role in standards. I spent a long time, 2+ decades now, looking at Chinese participation in standards bodies, talking to the folks that do it. And I can tell you, absolutely right. Yes, the Chinese show up in droves, very smart, very active. The growing number of proposals, proposals adopted, proportion of standard essential patents, licensing royalties are going to the Chinese in 5G. They're just rolling out their standards 2035 strategy. This is really critical. And then also in finance, the Chinese are world leaders in digital finance and are rolling out digital currency. And we are really much slower on this. So there's a lot to do. The report, I think, puts out a lot of very good ideas about what we can do. I think with the Chinese, obviously, everything that you say in terms of domestic competitiveness, as well as, which includes inclusion, because we can't be competitive unless everyone is helping generate these technology and the ideas, as well as using these ideas. And so on the production side and on the access side. But we obviously have a lot of work to stiffen our defenses, to keep the Chinese out of our technology, and also to keep our technology from being used to promote their norms and values. It's not protectionist or intervening in Chinese politics to say we don't think our technology should help Chinese smart cities program, which are trying to catch political dissidents, or help with what they're doing in Xinjiang. That's just, we get 100% say in how our technology should be used. But I think although there's a certain agenda bilaterally that we need to engage with the Chinese on, that I know the Biden administration and Congress are paying close attention to, I think actually at the beginning going forward, most of the work is going to be done not bilaterally with China, but at home, particularly with rules related to data privacy, as well as our competitiveness. But I think with our allies and then globally, one of the things I think we need to reaffirm is that the stepping stones in the report, and that Wendy is going to talk about in more detail, need to get us to a global governance treaty on data that looks at privacy and cybersecurity and crime, research, and as well as the commercial applications of data. Eventually we need global rules on this, and we should look at these other elements as stepping stones, whether it's regional, plurilateral, or at home, to get us to the type of world that we want, not the type of world that Beijing wants.
Thank you, Scott. A lot to follow up on there. But I'm going to next turn to Wendy and get her thoughts on how we should move forward with Asia.
Well, thanks so much, Orit, and it's just really my pleasure to be on this panel with such a distinguished group of folks. And really, what an excellent report you guys produced. And the fact that you have, not only you present the problems and the challenges, but you came forward with concrete solutions. Kudos to you, because we're all looking for actions that can be taken. I thought what I would do then is just really hone in on one of your recommendations, and that is the idea of creating a Pacific digital agreement. And I couldn't agree more with Scott that this is a stepping stone. This isn't the solution, but this is an area kind of ripe for movement and action. And why the Asia Pacific? Well, you know, it's a dynamic and growing region. They are all over the current technologies and already moving into the advanced technologies. And furthermore, we would not be starting from scratch. There are a lot of digital agreements in the region already. It's interesting that CPTPP, once we left, the other countries, they went through the agreement and they decided to kind of pick off certain provisions. But guess what? They kept the digital provisions intact, which I think shows that they recognize they need these rules and regulations to promote the type of trade in these products and services that they are interested in. Since the CPTPP came into effect, we've seen a number of other agreements crop up in the region. You mentioned some of them, Orit. Singapore and Australia added on to their FTA with a new digital agreement. Singapore now is negotiating with Korea along the same lines. And we have this digital economy partnership agreement led by New Zealand, Chile, and Singapore, which I'm going to get to in a minute, because I think that agreement offers a lot for us to think about going forward in this space. I think if we were to express our interest in joining and leading a Pacific digital agreement, we could play a key role in trying to weave these existing agreements together, kind of prevent the fragmentation, Orit, that you had referred to in your opening comments. And moreover, since we are not ready now to rejoin the CPTPP, that doesn't mean we can't engage in the region. We need to engage in the region. And I think the digital area is a real open door for us. And it could be also a building block, perhaps, for later consideration of rejoining the CPTPP. We can achieve high standards. And as Congresswoman Murphy said, we need to be at the table setting the rules. And just to give you a concrete example, when you look at the e-commerce chapter of the recently concluded RCEP agreement between 15 Asian countries, there are so many loopholes in that chapter. I mean, there's a lot of we shall endeavor to do this, we'll cooperate if appropriate. And then there's this huge public policy exception that basically, here are the rules, but if you decide on your own that it's not in your own public policy interest, you don't need to follow those rules. So we need to be at the table shaping these rules, because what I fear is some of these RCEP rules may find their way into other digital agreements if we don't get ready and we don't engage. Just to then talk for a minute or so about this digital economy partnership agreement. Again, New Zealand and Singapore have brought it into effect already, with Chile working on ratification. And I understand Canada may join this arrangement soon. There's an open door. And what's fascinating about it, it's not just a trade agreement. There are different modules affecting everything from cybersecurity to small and medium-sized enterprises. There's a module on digital inclusiveness and a lot of other areas. And it provides kind of a unique way where countries can join certain modules if they're not ready for all modules. And I think that's something we should think about going forward, particularly if we want to expand the net of countries that can participate in this type of agreement, not only our closest allies, but other partners that are looking for an alternative to the Chinese model. And let me just conclude on that. I think while, a lot of the reasons why we should do this, we have China in the back of our mind and their system, but I think it's important that we think about this in terms of our own interests, an alternative to the Chinese model, and not a defensive exercise, but an offensive exercise.
Thank you. Really great remarks from everybody, and a lot to chew on. So I'm gonna go back to the two congresswomen and say, there's a lot of recommendations we had in the report, a lot that's been discussed in this panel. What is the appetite in Congress? Do you all think, let's say, to pass federal privacy legislation, to do some of the things that, increase funding for US competitiveness? And also, what is the appetite on China? I fear that almost the pendulum has swung very, very far to be a hawk on China. And I think there's a danger in the pendulum swinging too far. So I wanted to just get both of your thoughts on, where Congress is on all these issues and what really we can expect during this upcoming session. Congresswoman Del Bene, and then.
Sure. First, I'll take the question on privacy, since I'm pushing on that effort. I think it's a difficult issue because it's an issue that people don't understand very well. I do think that that's part of the challenge we have with a lot of the technology issues that we discuss. It's not really partisan, so therein lies an opportunity. It's that folks don't necessarily feel like they have the background or understanding to know what the right legislative solutions might be. And privacy has been one where I've worked to make sure we have a specific bill. So we're talking about specific legislation, not just concepts. We're beyond that area at this point. And states are moving because they feel like in the absence of the federal government taking action, that they at least will make sure they're doing work to provide protections for consumers. That puts us in a very difficult position because it means that we have a patchwork. We don't have a consistent standard. It has huge challenges, especially for small businesses. Consumers don't know what their rights are across the country, but it also means that we don't have a voice at the international table. So I think one, folks need to have a sense of urgency, and it's important, just like the conversation we're having now, that that sense of urgency conveyed. I push very hard on this, but I think it's important that people make those connections to the absence of action in Congress, what that means in terms of relationships, in terms of setting standards. I also think privacy is very foundational. So if we're going to talk about things like facial recognition, AI, it's hard to move forward there if we don't have a strong foundation in privacy. Then to your point on international standards, and I actually served on working on international standards in email many moons ago. And so I definitely think that it's critically important we have folks at the table. And so I think resourcing that is easier, defining the policy that we are going to support and pushing for that in a coordinated way may be the greater challenge, and not just on privacy, but privacy, like I said, is a great place to start. So I think we have a chance because I think we can build bipartisan support, but I think it's gonna also take folks collectively talking about why this is so connected to many other things, why it's urgent, why we're behind, and why this has to be a priority for folks in Congress to act on. I'll let Stephanie add more.
Thanks, Susan. So I'll take the China and the investments question. On China, I share your concern a little bit about the pendulum swinging. You know, China is a complicated foreign policy, economic policy, you know, military, national security issue. And my concern is that for politically expedient reasons, China played a central role in the last elections, this whole socialism thing. I mean, the images of me with a Mao Zedong hat on, which shouts racism, one, but two, as a political cudgel in my campaign was shocking to me. But it was, you know, they tried to tie, the Republicans for politically expedient reasons tried to tie Democrats to socialism and Chinese wherever they could. And so it almost feels like a second era of McCarthyism, where and the outcome of that will be the same kind of outcome that we had with the first era of McCarthyism, which is one, it dumbs down our foreign policy approach to a complicated country. It limits our range of mobility and nuanced ability to address the foreign policy concerns. And it destroys people's careers needlessly because the connection isn't actually what is there. So I think it's really dangerous that the Republican Party has weaponized China, because that makes for less nuanced strategy at a moment when we need bipartisan, nuanced approaches towards China. And so that, having said that, I think that is a real challenge, one that we need to, it's not too late to walk this back and be more united as America in addressing the China challenge. On the willingness for making the investments into whether it's supporting our tech companies or making the necessary investments into developing our tech capabilities. I think we have a real opportunity. We are looking at the next bill being a bill that's focused on recovery. So if what we're working on right now is COVID relief, the next one is about recovery. And that means an economic recovery. And people have talked a lot about potentially having it be focused around infrastructure investments. And within that, I think there's a lot of opportunity to make investments into whether it's training, closing the digital divide, all the domestic things that we have talked about, that the panelists have talked about, are necessary to make us stronger on the world stage and to, reduce inequities and all of that. And you can't talk about infrastructure now without people throwing in broadband along with bridges and roads. So I think that's a really good opportunity and an openness to making those investments. And then one thing that you had mentioned in the ALI report that I thought was really interesting, which was a digital Marshall Plan. And that's really an idea worth considering because one, it helps our domestic companies at a moment where we're all trying to pull out of an economic recession. But two, it provides an answer to what has been kind of a one-sided thing. The United States has said to our partners and allies and people all across the country, all across the world, hey, don't buy Huawei or don't engage with Chinese companies, but we haven't necessarily given them a viable alternative. But if you have a digital Marshall Plan, you can provide and enable a viable U.S. alternative. And, there's much talk about the BRI, the Chinese BRI, and that is physical infrastructure that they are marching out all over the world building. I think bang for a buck, a digital Marshall Plan could be a nice counterpoint to the BRI. So I think lots of opportunities in that space.
Great. Well, thank you for the endorsement of the digital Marshall Plan. I've been sort of trying to push that for years. It really started early on. I worked for GE for many years, and saw there how we competed with Chinese companies with subsidized financing on whether it was rail or power facilities. And we would have governments coming to us all the time saying, we really want your equipment because we know that it's better quality, it's cleaner. You train our workers as opposed to bringing your own, the Chinese workers. You invest in our communities, but we can't afford it, because China's offering us, 15 years with no money down. Can you match that? Well, if you're a for-profit company, you can't match that. And obviously, in the digital sphere, you have that on steroids, really. And so it's really a challenge. I'm going to turn now to Scott. And, one of the things that there's been a lot of discussion on, and, I think everyone agrees that on some level, we need to decouple with China on some key technology issues, technology products or sectors, but we really don't want, and nor is it viable, to decouple across the board. And so how do we walk that line? Where is that line? How do we manage the relationship where we really protect certain technologies, but really but continue to engage in a way that is constructive?
Sure. That's really important. And I think what the conversation shows is how urgent it is not only to have new policies, but to also have balanced policies. That because of the urgency, we just don't do everything without thinking about them and see this in black and white terms. This is complex, but but that complexity shouldn't stop us from acting in a way that's balanced. The idea of decoupling is one idea about how you mitigate risk. It says the dangers from a relationship with China are so grave and they can't be mitigated any other way. So we just basically have to disconnect. And the more we disconnect, the better we are in terms of our national security and protecting our values. And I think that assumption, if you analyze it, applies in certain circumstances, but not across the board. And having some types of connectivity, if they are gauged to fit with our values, can mitigate the risks and protect us even better than disconnecting. So it's not just a zero-sum trade-off between commerce on the one hand and national security on the other. You actually can get both things better if you have the right types of connections bilaterally and if we engage globally in the right way. So I think people may be familiar with the concept small yard, high fence. There's going to be some kinds of technologies that for national security reasons, we definitely don't want the Chinese to have. Shouldn't go to any type of Chinese company in any institution. And the type of export controls need to be extremely strong with those. And we may need to expand those. And, there was legislation passed in the previous Congress regarding emerging technologies, foundational technologies. And the Biden administration needs to carefully go through that work. We may end up having a slightly larger yard and slightly higher fence, but we need to define those lines and not just be unclear and ambiguous about it. But in addition to that and saying what's off limits, there are other ways in which we can mitigate risks. We can have product certification systems so we know what products are trusted and which can't be. We can do a much greater job of identifying trusted companies and owners of data. We can have rules regarding data localization where it can be stored, data content rules about how it should be, to make sure we don't allow for censorship or the misuse of data. So there's a whole variety of things we can do to mitigate risks besides just fragmenting the world into lots of different pieces. There's some things that we just have to protect no matter what, that you can't mitigate the risk any other way. But I think we have a large toolbox, a growing toolbox to manage these kinds of risks that we need to draw on beyond just simply the decoupling one.
Any other comments on that point? I'm going to throw in, so a lot of what we discussed in the paper, starts with repairing relationships with allies. We talked a lot about the need to reach out to Europe, Japan, and other allies. Wendy really talked a lot about reaching out to the Asia Pacific. And I think, as we all know, the U.S. has burned a lot of bridges over the past 4 years. So I guess I'm just posing the question both to Congresswoman Wendy, Scott, whoever wants to chime in, but what are people's thoughts about how open Europe and the Pacific are to some of these ideas and to negotiating with the U.S. right now, collaborating with the U.S.? Are we still seen as a trusted partner? I know that there's some thought that, how can we trust the U.S. because we don't know, things, Biden may have a good outlook, but how do we know that in 4 years, we're not going to get another president that is more America first-ish, who's going to throw that out and pull back. So I think, we're in kind of a complicated place. So I'm going to, Congresswoman Del Bene, I saw you kind of nodding, so I'll let you answer. And then why don't we do a round robin and get everybody's thoughts?
Okay. Well, first, I think if we want stability, that's where we need real policy. And that's why I do think congressional action is so important. It's not the view of anyone in particular in the administration. It is our law, and that's in place, and that gives us the chance for that to stay constant. between administrations going forward. So I do think and to your point on trust, if we make sure that we pass policy on things like data privacy, et cetera, I do think in our work with the EU, that creates some of that trust going forward, because they know what our values are, what our policy is, and this was a priority that passed in Congress. But I do think your point is very important in terms of building back that trust. That's going to take time. But I do think that having things in policy, having Congress take action on many issues and not just on technology issues is important to provide that stability of policy going forward.
Congresswoman Murphy.
Yeah, so I think the unfortunate outcome of the last 4 years is that we taught our allies that we may not be reliable, and that the pendulum swings and could create real consequences on their relationship with us. And in fact, you see that reflected in President Macron's comments, in his, calling on Europe to be more independent of the United States. You see that in what's going on in Asia, where we withdrew from TPP and they moved on with CTP and RCEP. I always mess up that the new TPP. It's too many letters, but you saw our traditional partners, one, absorb the shock of, wait, this is a different United States than the one that we've known for the last century, and then learn the lesson that, you know what, this might happen every 4 years to us, and so we're going to move on without the United States because we can't afford to wait. And so I think that that's a lesson that will be hard to unwind. And I don't know that it is unwindable. So they've moved on. The other thing, though, is that there is an opportunity for the Biden administration to reclaim a seat at the table. But one area that I'm actually a little disappointed to see them to continue the Trump policies is in the trade space. So the Trump administration very intentionally allowed the WTO appellate body to languish by basically not appointing any people to it. And so it allowed it to languish. And now we see the Biden administration continuing that policy. And I get that there are a lot of issues and reform that needs to happen with that appellate body. But by allowing that body to languish, what you are communicating to the world is that you either are unwilling to bolster the institutions that we as America help build, that create the guardrails and create accountability for all the world actors who are engaged in trade, and that you don't want to be held accountable. So I don't know if it's wittingly or unwittingly, but the Biden administration is underscoring that message that the Trump administration sent with the trade body, which is that maybe we don't believe in multilateral institutions that hold the players accountable anymore. And I certainly hope that isn't the position that they stay with. I hope that they aggressively look at reforming the appellate body, but allowing it to languish sends a terrible message about the United States and undermines our ability to reassure our allies and others around the world that we're still committed to international institutions and the rule of law that governs our global interactions.
Yeah, thank you. I definitely support your comments on the WTO, and I hope that obviously the administration has many, many crises they're dealing with at this point, and I hope that down the line, I think they will want to shore the WTO up. So I'm going to ask Wendy now. We talked a lot about agreements with the Asia Pacific. How they have moved on. How are they going to welcome us back with open arms? How do you see that working?
So I think the good news is, at least the folks I talk to, they want us back, right? They're open arms there, but yet things have changed over the past 4 years. They're much more self-confident. They've kind of figured out how to work with us to work on trade agreements without us. They like trade agreements. They see these as vehicles for creating jobs and for attracting foreign direct investment. And so in some ways, we're going to have to earn our way back. We're going to have to rebuild the trust. And I think we're really going to need to listen. Earlier, there were comments about, we need to be nuanced with respect to how we deal with China or how we deal with privacy and other issues. I think this is another area we're going to need to listen. Things aren't black and white. We're going to need to understand where our trading partners are coming from here. But that said, they want us back. And so what my hope is that we find a way to re-engage early, not just by saying the right things, but by pursuing initiatives. And just back to the ALI report, I think pursuing a Pacific digital agreement is something that's like right, it fits right in with what we should be doing to rebuild trust, develop high standards, but not try and take everything on at once, but do things that are impactful and show that we can be trusted. And we're all in.
Thank you. I'm going to pivot now to a couple audience questions. We have a question from Deborah Marks with IBM. How do we make sure that the U.S. government decisions, let's say via CFIUS or export controls, of who gets access to advanced technologies isn't hijacked by political ideologues who have an axe to grind versus legitimate concerns about technology slipping into the wrong hands? That's obviously a loaded question. And I don't know that there's an easy answer, but I'm going to let anyone who wants to jump in on that, whether it's Scott or the members of Congress, take a. Scott, you want to take a first shot at that?
Sure. I think one of the ways that we can avoid the challenge that Deborah pointed out is to have very clear rules and procedures and have very transparent rules and procedures. The way we currently handle export controls, applications, and licensing is very different from the process that we have to review investment restrictions and things like that. So also aligning them and coordinating them, I think is very important. There's some information because there's national security involved that you can't share, but there's a much more about the process that can be shared that give greater confidence, both domestically, that certain interests aren't being favored over others, but also internationally, so that people have confidence and that our system has credibility. Because we often hear from the Chinese or others, oh, you blocked this investment or export of this just for selfish reasons with no justification. But if we had a clear rules, some more transparency, we could better defend ourselves. And of course, the Chinese are adopting their own rules related to export controls and investment screening. And we don't want to give them carte blanche to just do anything that they want. They may go beyond it anyway, but if we set the right standards, then we have a better basis from which to make sure they don't go farther overboard than we want. So I think that there's some ways to make some progress on this. Thanks.
So one more question, and I think we're going to have to wrap up. We've talked about trade agreements, about a Pacific digital trade agreement. And I'm going to ask the Congresswoman, what is the atmosphere in Congress regarding trade these days? I know that it hasn't really been popular to the right or the left. I think USMCA was unique in a lot of ways. I know that the administration and Congress have many, many, many things on their plate over the next couple years, recovering from COVID, getting the economy going, et cetera. Do you think there's any appetite for passing legislation like a digital trade agreement?
I guess I'm the starter and Stephanie's the closer, adds everything that all the important things that I missed. So first of all, I think USMCA was incredibly important. It was
Yes.
bipartisan. It brought folks together, and in a trying time, we passed an important piece of legislation. I do think that the enforcement will be key, and so there's going to be a lot of attention on the ongoing implementation and enforcement of the agreement, because I think one of the things that folks brought up in the past was having agreements but not feeling like there was strong enforcement. So I think there needs to continue to be work there so that people feel comfortable not only with the words of the agreement, but that there will actually be work to make sure the agreement works in a way that folks intended it to. So that's going to be of ongoing critical importance. I also think that supply chains and what we've seen with respect to the pandemic and shortages, et cetera, there's going to be a big focus on supply chains and what does that mean, and that obviously also impacts trade as we look at resilient supply chains, how that's going to work. And so I think you're going to see a lot of conversation following up from the pandemic in terms of what we do to be more resilient going forward. And then, but I do think, we'll have conversations on TPA coming up as we get going in Congress, since that's expires in July. I do think that USMCA was an important milestone, and I think we know that there is ongoing work to do. And we're behind on digital. We're party to USMCA, which has a digital chapter, but obviously we have work to do in all the areas that we discussed, and so it's not just it's updating on those issues. And obviously the EU, we have a bunch of issues that we'll have to work on with respect to the privacy shield and that decision and what that means going forward. So I think there will be a lot of focus on trade from a lot of different perspectives.
Congresswoman Murphy, I'm going to give you 30 seconds to wrap up because we're pressing against our deadline.
Okay, well, I do think that there is a protectionist element that is undercurrent that exists both in Congress and as well as potentially in the Biden administration. If you look at the number of bills that have been introduced in the last Congress, most of them are not about free and open markets and trading. And also the lessons learned about supply chain are also driving people more towards the idea of domestication as opposed to diversification of supply chain. So I think it's problematic. And also given the political base that brought the administration into power is not exactly pro-trade. So there are some challenges, but we need to keep trying because trade will be a key element of helping our economy recover.
Great. Well, so thank you guys. This has been absolutely fabulous. I could have kept asking many, many questions, and we have questions from the audience we didn't get to, which we will follow up on. Heartfelt thanks to all the panelists, to Steve Clemens, who did a great job moderating the first panel. And there are many challenges, but I am encouraged with kind of the action that Congress is looking to take, and the steps that the Biden administration has taken, and the emphasis that people are placing on global digital issues. Special thanks to the audience. You guys have been terrific. And for those who haven't downloaded our report, you can go to our website, www.american-leadership.org. I look forward to having everybody join our community in the future. Please contact us through our website or email me or any of the team members if you want more information. Stay safe, everybody. Be well. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.